Hello, folks. This is Chuck Dunning. I'm here to take some time today to tell you a little bit about my current book, my most recent one, The Contemplative Lodge, a manual for Masons doing inner work together. This is unscripted. I just want to share some personal review and reflections on this book. And I don't have it, like I said, don't have it scripted, so anything could happen. My cat is in my lap right now, so who knows what she'll want to do, if she'll want to be part of this or not, but here we go. So the first thing I want to do is draw your attention to the beautiful artwork here. This was done by the amazing artist Ryan Flynn, and you can find him at ryanflynn.com. He also has a Facebook page for Ryan J. Flynn Studios, J being the initial J, Ryan J. Flynn Studios. This is a really interesting piece of artwork that he did. It's significantly different from many of his other works. It's more of a kind of a modern art style in chalk. He typically tends to do painting and more of what, I kind of naively would think of as a Renaissance style. You'd have to ask Ryan if that's accurate or not. But one of the interesting things about this is that there are hidden Masonic symbols in the lines of the sky. And so you can see the square there. There are others, but I'll leave them for you to find. I'm just going to kind of go through this book a piece at a time, and I'm going to read the afterword in its entirety, and you'll understand why when I do that. Before I actually get into the book, let's talk about what's on the back of the book, and that's these three nice reviews from Art de Hoyos, Angel Millar, and Michael Pohl. These three brothers all did pre-publication reviews on this book and thought well of it enough to write back cover blurbs for me. I want to thank each of you if you're watching this video for doing so. I highly respect the work that each of you does, and to have your words of approval associated with this book means a lot to me, so thank you very much. On a similar note, the foreword for this book was written by my dear friend, Brother Robert G. Davis. Bob, as those of us who are close to him know, Bob and I have been working together in Freemasonry on a number of projects to help enhance the deeper aspects of Masonry for over a couple of decades now. And I really value his friendship, and I deeply respect the work that he has done in Freemasonry. And so to have his words in the foreword for this book is also deeply meaningful to me. Here you'll see the inside cover that I chose for this book. It's a well-known depiction of the beehive, which is an important Masonic symbol. Those of us who work with Preston Webb ritual will have this as actually part of our monitorial content, and some of us actually hear about this in our ritual as well. This may not be in some other versions of the ritual, but I think it's highly appropriate and says a lot about the ideal Masonic organization. The dedication is to divine wisdom, and I'd like to explain a little bit more about that. Divine wisdom is often personified in the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and others. That is often personified in feminine form, that is the divine aspect, the feminine aspect of the divine. And so, for example, in Greek versions of the book of Proverbs, she is referred to as Sophia and directly referenced with feminine language in the book of Proverbs, chapter 8. In fact, that dedication blurb is redacted from chapter 8 in the book of Proverbs. I encourage you to read that chapter. I think it's an inspiring one for me. And I think that this idea of divine wisdom captures the essence of what it is that Freemasonry is calling us to connect with in our lives, to embody in our lives, and to express through our actions in the world and in our relationships with others. I talk a lot about love. I actually think that there is a very tight relationship between wisdom and love, and at the highest levels of spiritual reality or insight, that ultimately wisdom and love cannot be distinguished from each other. The acknowledgments, of course, you could read those if you wanted to catch all of them. I will make special note of my editor, Eric Arneson, brother Eric Arneson, who also did the first podcast conversation with me about this book, just recently released. And you can find that on my website at chuckdunning.com. You can find a link to it there. You can also find a link to it at my YouTube channel, which you're watching now. And the Kevin and Lisa Main of Stone Guild Publishing, they're the publishers of this book. I want to thank them so much for all of their support of my work and their friendship that I've enjoyed for a long, long time. Very much like family to me. There's some other recognitions in here. Certainly Susan, my wife, and for her support. None of this would be possible if she wasn't supportive and encouraging of me sharing these messages and ideas with my brother Masons. And I give a special acknowledgement to my late mentor, brother Dr. Jim Tresner, 33rd degree in Grand Cross. He was a wonderful human being. He had a great intelligence and a huge heart. If you're not familiar with his writings, you should be. He wrote predominantly about the Scottish Rite, but not entirely about that. And he just had a profound impact on me. I'm so grateful that I was able to develop as close of a relationship with him as I could. And so it's important for me to dedicate this book to his memory. Okay. Chapter 1 is on the communal dimension of contemplation in the craft. This is talking about how all of our mythology, our ritual and symbolism in Freemasonry points not only to individual work, to what we as individuals must do, but it also points to the importance of our ability to cooperate, coordinate, collaborate with others in team efforts. I mean, just think about the building of King Solomon's temple. If it had just been a bunch of individuals each doing their own thing without being able to be a cohesive unit together, well, it never would have been built, and we wouldn't be talking about it today. So that really plays through into the contemplative dimension as well. There are benefits to the contemplative dimension that I examine in this chapter, and there are also some risks that need to be considered, and I talk about those in more depth in the chapter. I also talk about what it takes to actually organize contemplative groups within the fraternity, whether that be in a lodge, whether it be a private study group that does contemplative practices, or some other Masonic body like the Scottish Rite or the Allied Masonic Degrees, York Rite, whatever. There can be administrative, political, and even legal things that need to be taken into consideration when you're trying to form a working contemplative group. And I address all of those kinds of issues in that first chapter. In the second chapter, Ways of Working Together, I actually talk about, okay, what are some contemplative activities that should be done by Masons together in groups? So we've got contemplative discourse in there, also sometimes referred to as contemplative dialogue or reflective dialogue. This idea of having some sort of a contemplative experience, which could be just the ritual itself, by the way, that's a contemplative activity. but having some sort of a contemplative experience, and then looking back on it, reflecting back on it, to share our thoughts and feelings with each other about its possible meaning, how it can be relevant to our lives, how we can apply its lessons so that we can be better Masons and better human beings. In the section on group meditation, I talk about lots of different forms of group meditation, everything from silent sitting to very sophisticated forms of visualization, like guided meditation, some kinds of energy work, and so on. There's information in there about chanting, which I think is a very important and valuable way of Masons actually manifesting a kind of spiritual unity with each other in a very tangible, immediately acknowledgeable way. So chapter 2 is really about the essence of contemplative work together. I mean, how you do it, not just the ideas of it and what's good about it and why you should do it, that sort of thing, but how you do it. And then the third chapter is on contemplative leadership. Now, there's a lot being written about leadership in Masonry today, different training programs and so on that are being offered by Grand Lodges and other bodies for leadership in Masonry. But I believe that I'm the only one so far to be talking about leadership in the contemplative dimension. Well, I'll give you one exception to that, and that's the Masonic Legacy Society. They're doing work to train people to be facilitators of contemplative activities in Freemasonry. And so if you're interested in that kind of training, then I highly encourage you to look into the Masonic Legacy Society. The website is Masonic Legacy Society 2026.com, 2026. I'm one of the co-founders of that organization. And so I am intimately familiar with what they have to offer. I highly recommend that you check it out. Now, the difference here is, while I do have an appendix in this book that talks about the development of facilitation skills, and I'll be telling you about that more in a moment, what I offer in this third chapter is an examination of the kinds of leadership that are necessary to enhance the contemplative dimension of our Masonic experiences that we share together in groups. And so when we talk about that, we need to acknowledge that there are essentially three different kinds of contemplative leadership. And if you can see that diagram right there, you'll see that that's building on a diagram that I devised in my first book, Contemplative Masonry, to talk about the kinds of relationships that exist within Masonry. And within the intersections of those relationships, now I have identified these three ways that leadership gets exercised. And one is advocacy. Advocacy is the promotion of contemplative practice within Freemasonry, helping others understand what's good about it, why we would be interested in it as Freemasons, how it resonates with Freemasonry, how it makes sense within a Masonic context, and what its benefits are, and also to be inspiring to others, to help them understand with your own personal stories of your own contemplative experiences, how it has enhanced your life. And that's a very inspiring thing when people can relate to you as a human being and not just someone who's talking about these concepts abstractly. Facilitation is another aspect of contemplative leadership, and that's the ability to be able to lead these contemplative activities, which I've already mentioned before, and I'll talk about a little bit more as we go forward. It's one thing to advocate, and we need that. It's another thing to provide a real experience of contemplative practice, and we definitely need that because many of us just don't have a lot of real world experience with it. And to take it from the idea to the practice is, it's really helpful to have people who know what they're doing to help us make that movement. And then the final aspect of contemplative leadership that I highlight in this book is consulting. being a consultant to others, whether groups or individuals. And people who do consulting really need to have a good background of practice of their own and familiarity with the experiences of others so that they can kind of help mentor and guide others along in their practice and get the most out of those experiences for themselves. I talk about some of the ethical things that are required for contemplative leadership. There's a couple of ethical pillars that I refer to. I talk about the basic qualifications for each of those three kinds of contemplative leadership. I think there's a lot there for individuals or for groups who are wanting to really dig into some of the meatier parts of what it takes to really progress this side of the Masonic experience, this aspect of the Masonic experience. There's the afterward, which I will be reading to you in its entirety in a moment, and the appendices. Actually, most of the book is appendices because after the first one, the other two appendices is Appendix A, Appendix B, and C. B and C are really scripts for contemplative activities that a facilitator can take and then actually just follow step by step to lead groups of Masons through contemplative activities. Some of these would even be suitable for including non-Masons if everybody in the group understood that non-Masons were present, and then it wouldn't be appropriate to share certain things that we guard as privy to Masons alone. But the first appendix is on facilitator skills development. It covers voice skills, things that you need to know about how to use your voice effectively. It covers the 8 steps of guided meditation. So what are the steps? If you're going to be guiding people through a meditation, what are the steps that you need to go through that would be part of just about any meditative group experiences? And so I think you could use that to easily develop your own abilities. And then Appendix B is contemplative discourse scripts. So I was talking about that earlier. These are really provide some initial ways of getting some contemplative experience and then discussing that with each other. The 3 topics that I have chosen as introductory for contemplative discourse are initiation. So that's discourse script number 1. Discourse script number 2 is the blazing star. And then number 3 is the common gavel. And you can see that those are really foundational to a lot of what Masonry is about and why we would want to be involved in Masonry in the deepest possible way. Then I get into Appendix C with all of the different group meditation scripts. And again, it's everything from silent sitting all the way to chanting, working on particular symbols, doing guided meditations that are more like being immersed in a story and that has symbolic value, and some energy work about tapping into these energies that we experience emotionally and that have an effect on our thoughts and on our bodies, and being able to use those to intentionally engage in deeper ways with our Masonic experience. There is an index in this version. My first book didn't have an index in it, but this one does. I really want to thank the Mains, Kevin and Lisa Main, for helping with this index. This is a hugely important part of this book. This is really meant to be a guidebook, a textbook that groups of Masons can use and refer to frequently to develop the kind of group work that can deeply enhance their Masonic experiences and benefit their Masonic organizations. And rather than having to search to find things, you can just go into the index and look up what it is that you're trying to find again, and there it will be. All right. So I said that I would read the afterward to you, and as I do so, it will explain why the afterword is an important part of this book. Dear reader, I want to wrap things up by again addressing you more personally. As I write this, I'm sitting on my back porch, happy for the cool air on a morning of what will surely become another scorching Texas August day. I've already been awake for a while and just came out with my cup of coffee after some contemplative practice and a few morning chores. Settling into my purpose in this moment, I feel your presence here with me in a way, and I want you to know how welcome you are and how pleasant it is to know I'm being welcomed by you. The rest of the manuscript for this manual was completed and sent to the publisher months ago. And ever since then, I've had the feeling that it just wasn't quite done. That's not a new feeling for me because I relate to basically everything I write as a work in progress and never beyond improvement. In this case, I felt there was something else that might be said in the Contemplative Lodge, but I found myself resisting the notion of a typical conclusion with a summary of what I'd written. Then, in the midst of a contemplative moment, I realized that I wanted to say more about the why of this book, the deeper motives and intentions for writing it. To that end, let me share a little story. About 2 weeks ago, my wife and I were at a cabin in the lovely Hocking Hills region of Ohio, vacationing with another couple who have been dear friends for many years. We've taken lots of camping trips together and share a mutual love of hiking, campfire time, playing games, and talking about life. My daily pattern has been to rise earlier than the others, find a place in the woods, and take time for solitary contemplative practice. On the Ohio trip, my morning contemplations were spent on our cabin's back porch. It jutted out over the hillside, enfolded by pines and oaks that formed a canopy of green, gray, and brown. Each morning I sat there, watching the early rays of the sun penetrate the humid air, caress the boughs and trunks, and alight onto the forest floor. As I often do in such moments, I recalled Masonry's teaching that we should contemplate the beauties and harmonies of nature. On one of those mornings, my attention was drawn to the vibrant complexity of everything. The crickets' nighttime chorus faded away as the birds sang their awakening, and it all flowed in cycles, with the light of the sun prompting different species to play different parts in different movements through nature's one continuous composition. What I was appreciating in that moment was the interconnection of everything, the interdependence of being that nature constantly displays. Everything exists in relationship with everything else. The basic reason we hold geometry of symbolic importance is because it describes how things are related to each other. Geometry is essential to understanding the shape of a crystal, the growth of a snail's shell, the apparent movement of celestial bodies, or the construction of a temple. We are taught that geometry is, in a speculative sense, synonymous with Masonry, which suggests an analogy. Just as geometry is about discerning and describing relationships among things in the 3 dimensions of physical existence, so the builder's art is about discerning and describing relationships among things in the various dimensions of social and spiritual existence. So, Masonry is meant to be the craft of relationships, and it therefore concerns itself with the relationships among the parts within one's own psyche, the relationships between individual people, relationships within and between groups, with other creatures, and with the divine. This makes perfect sense to me because relationship is essential to our existence. None of us would be here in the world if it were not for relationships. We were conceived in the relationship of our parents, gestated and birthed in the relationship with our mothers. We were nurtured, educated, and developed in relationships with family, friends, and teachers. And we manifest our potentials as adults within a vast and complex myriad of human and non-human relationships. Even the most basic requirements of our continuing survival, such as eating and breathing, depend upon the proper maintenance of many different relational factors. Furthermore, after death, the memories and other effects of our lives continue in the relationships of others. Ruminating on all of this during one of those mornings in Ohio, I also considered the many angles of relevance to the Contemplative Lodge. I realized that everything I have meant to accomplish with this book fits within a context of deeper understandings, experiences, and expressions of relationship. It then dawned on me to submit these reflections for your consideration. Please keep in mind that I am not denying the importance of our self-realization and self-actualization as individual beings. As I have indicated, the relationships among one's own psychological and spiritual parts are included, and perhaps foremost, among all the others we should contemplate and develop. However, as we do so, we cannot fail to eventually observe that even the deepest or most hidden parts of ourselves are affected by our external relationships and vice versa. It seems patently clear to me that Masonry acknowledges as much. Therefore, to avoid attending to our craft in either the internal or the external dimensions of our lives is an injustice to ourselves, to others, and to the builder's art. There is another word traditionally used in our rituals that illuminates the essence of relationship as well as its greatest potentials, and that word is love. Whether we are speaking of the principal tenet of brotherly love, the theological virtue of charity, caritas in Latin, agape in Greek, or the sense of pleasant camaraderie spread by the symbolic trowel, our craft repeatedly draws our attention to love, welcomes us to dive more deeply into its mysteries, and admonishes us to embody it more fully in the architecture of our lives. Finally, I am convinced that the reasons we set our meeting spaces apart from the profane world is because they are meant to be schools for contemplating and practicing our inner and outer relationships as sacred acts of love. We need tiled spaces for this work simply because the world often seems unconcerned with, if not actively hostile toward those ends. We need the thresholds and rituals of such spaces to help us make the shifts necessary to fully open our minds, hearts, and arms to joining for those purposes. Within these spaces, having made those shifts, we have opportunities to empower ourselves and each other to then apply the loving art of sacred relationships back out in the profane world, thereby doing our parts to help make ourselves and the world wiser, stronger, and more beautiful. This great work is why we need contemplative lodges and contemplative leaders. Well, thank you for watching this video. If you're interested in purchasing the book, you can do so at Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble, and you might even find some used copies out there available by now. The Kindle edition should be coming soon. I hope that if you already have a copy, you'll consider getting one also for your Masonic library, at whatever lodge or other Masonic organizations you belong to. Please keep in mind that I don't profit from these books, that the profits go right back into Freemasonry in different ways. So thank you so much again for your time and attention, and I'll be talking to you again soon, I hope. Bye-bye.